today we're going to be talking about enhanced weathering, and this is based on a presentation I gave a few weeks ago to some investors. I actually thought I would keep the content because I think whatever investors think about, we as people sort of actively, as practitioners out in the field, we need to be aware that the people with the money also need to be sort of educated on this. So if you see in the background, that is Mick Jagger on this first screen, and he actually has, with the Rolling Stones, sung a song called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, which I do recommend you listen to, because he actually does talk about people being hungry, and that's going to be one of the themes of my conversation today. So where are we going to go with this? So I think, first of all, I always like to start with the problems. Then you're probably wondering, why do I keep talking about killing 3 birds with 1 rock? So we'll go into that. Where is enhanced weathering today, and what direction is it going in? And finally, yes, the considerations, not just for investors, but us all around the room. So what are the problems? First of all, I think if I say climate change, if you're sitting in the UK, or if you're sitting in Kenya or wherever else you are, we're all aware of it, right? And I think I'm going to throw a few statistics out now, but one of them is that scientists predict that anywhere between 6 and 10 gigatons, so that's billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, will have to be removed from the atmosphere by 2050, between 6 and 10. So that's already a wide range. And I read somewhere that we've only managed to remove about 10,000 tons in total till now. Whatever the number is, it's tiny. One significant contributor to this is our food system. So food production is both a cause, if you like, and a victim of climate change. And if you've seen this story in the National Geographic, it's the fact that our food is becoming less nutritious. And again, that's something I'm going to be talking about today. What's really important is by 2100, we anticipate that there'll be 11 billion human beings on this planet. And it's not, of course, just about the quantity of food, it is also about the quality, the nutrition. What's really important as well is that the tropics, where I am, are where much of the population growth is. And fertilizer use in this part of the world, soluble fertilizer use, isn't at the level it needs to be, insofar as when we pull food out of the ground, we need to be putting the nutrients back in. And in the tropics, often they're not affordable or accessible, and yield responses to some of the dominant fertilizers today, like NPK, are actually risking becoming negligible or even zero because we're ignoring the nutrient deficiencies. The last problem here, which may not be sort of top of mind for everybody, is mining waste. And, how do countries dispose of it? So a little bit about geoengineering, just to set the context, because when I gave this presentation the first time, people asked me what geoengineering is. If you look at the sort of Oxford Dictionary or Oxford University definitions, it's when we are intervening deliberately and on scale with the Earth's natural systems, and that's really to counteract this anthropogenic climate change. What this means, it's in 2 broad camps. One is around carbon geoengineering or greenhouse gas removal. The 2 terms, carbon and greenhouse gas, tend to get used a little bit sort of loosely interchangeably. In terms of carbon geoengineering, there are some areas which are, I think, more familiar to people, like planting trees or replanting trees. That's deemed to be at technological readiness level 9. There's biochar. I know a number of people on the call today are familiar with biochar. And if you've heard me speak before, you're going to be very familiar with biochar, and that's at TRL 5. These are levels as per the UK. And what we're going to be talking about today is enhanced weathering, which is TRL level 4. And I think what's really important is, yes, we are caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place when it comes to climate change, but we'll go into sort of more detail as I continue. So what is enhanced weathering? First of all, what is natural weathering? So in nature today, silicate rocks, and an example being basalt, naturally, if you go back to your geography lessons, you'll remember that these rocks naturally react with carbon dioxide from acid rain. And that is then locked away as bicarbonate. And we estimate today that that's responsible for about 0.3% of global fossil fuel emissions absorption. Agriculture, of course, is, as I said earlier, is a major driving force of climate change, and particularly soil degradation, rendering about 10 million hectares of cropland unproductive every year. And that's from about 12 million square kilometers of total arable land. What the nutrients from the silicate rocks do is that they contribute to the health of these crops and they protect them from pests and diseases. What we're talking about now is speeding up this process, right? So accelerating a nature-based solution, and we take that same rock material, we mill it so as to increase the reactive surface area and weathering rate, and we spread it on the land. Fertilizer can be toxic. Rock dust is deemed not to be toxic, although we'll talk later about some of the risks, and it doesn't leach into the soils. Now, this potential carbon dioxide removal figure, as you can see, is quite broad. Why is that? Because we are still learning about it. There's a lot of modeling going on today, and there's increasingly field scale testing. But until we do some of this testing and gather the data, we're remaining with a sort of very broad estimate. That said, under the right circumstances, and the circumstances are what we need to learn about, these silicate rock powders can advance low cost, if done in the right conditions, and regional soil sustaining crop production. So we'll talk about spreading these silicate rock powders or rock dust on farmland, possibly forests, but it does depend on the soil. Then the plants and the microbes do their magic, and we are killing 2 or maybe 3 birds with one rock. Why is this different, or why is this important vis-a-vis other carbon geoengineering techniques? At the end of the day, we're farming anyway. We're not competing for land. We're using land that is already being planted and worked on throughout the year. So what that means is we're not competing either for land or for fresh water, and the infrastructure already exists. It's really worth remembering this because some of the techniques that we hear about more often actually require taking up land, and often arable land. So I think it is quite an important point. Where is enhanced weathering going? I think the key thing about this slide is really the fact is that, as I said, natural weathering has been going on for a while and farmers have been aware of it, right? So if we look at some trials on cocoa some time ago, they realized that they would end up with sort of higher concentrations of certain nutrients, and after 2 years the plants looked healthier. And even in Mauritius there's been trials going back to 60 odd years or usage of enhanced weathering on sugarcane. Again, a yield increase. But now what's increasingly happening is that there's more and more focus not just on the agricultural benefits, but also greenhouse gas removal. And one name you will keep seeing time and time again is the University of Sheffield, which is, I think this last project you can see on the screen is UK government funding to the tune of £4.6 million, where they're doing 3 large-scale field trials in different parts of England and Wales. And they're already starting to see some positive results. But as you can see from the dates here, this is ongoing. I think what's really key is that for us to get more and more confidence in enhanced weathering, we have to keep doing these trials, but on large scale, and keep gathering the data. So here's another trial or another paper published by colleagues at the University of Antwerp that I've worked with, and on potato, right? For all the obvious reasons, it's a rather popular crop. So from an investor perspective, and then, as I said again at the beginning, what should we all be thinking about when we're looking at enhanced weathering projects? The first thing is, understanding if you've got a portfolio of different greenhouse gas removal tools you're looking at, where is enhanced weathering on the spectrum? And as I said earlier, it's still at TRL 4. What are some of the projections going forward for carbon dioxide equivalent removals? what are the assumptions we're making, and so on and so forth. I think these graphs here are actually I say only from October, but even since these graphs were published, there's been more data which could actually impact the relative carbon dioxide removals from these different techniques. And this is just from the UK government's perspective. So you can see that the sliver for enhanced weathering is actually, at that point, was still quite small compared to some of the other techniques. But for me, these are sort of moving targets. I think what is really important is continuing, and I've said this more than once, and I will keep saying it, continuing this research. Wherever you are, these are just cases of what's going on in the UK and in the US. At the last COP, the US government announced increased funding to go into all of this sort of R&D. And I think what's important is these 4 points here. What the US government really wants to think about is obviously the cost of carbon dioxide removal, and that's the net cost. So not just removing it, but all the costs associated with capturing, storage, and so on. But also, how are we going to account for these life cycle emissions, right? So when you're removing carbon dioxide, it's not just about the cost of spreading the rock dust on the farmland, for example. It's how much did it cost in terms of getting the rocks, crushing the rocks, and so on. And then making sure that when we talk about removal, how long are we talking about it for? This is all still quite new to us. And also, how scalable is this? Here are some startups doing some work in this space. I'm not going to talk about them in particular detail, but it goes back to the point I made, I think, before most people joined, that the airplane has taken off, we're having to change the wheels. So it's not just about doing basic research, it's also applied research, it's also startups, it's also public-private partnerships. And I think from a UK perspective, these are the timelines that the UK sees, that we'll see the first significant deployment in 2030. Then, like any technology, there'll be some slow rate of uptake for the first decade, and then from 2040 onwards, there'll be more adoption of this. And let's see, but that's what the timelines are from the UK's perspective. So what are some of the technical considerations? First of all, when you are sourcing your minerals, is it mining waste? Where we are in the East African Rift, there are shallow deposits, and there's been some exciting research produced by the University of Nairobi and the Institute for Climate Change and Adaptation on where the deposits are across Kenya. So Central Rift seem to be quite promising, which is good for me, and I'll explain why in a minute. But also, you might be able to use mining waste today, but what about in the future? What happens when that mining waste runs out? Do we need new mines? Of course, the impacts from an environmental and energy perspective, ecological perspective, typically until now, the studies show that you're going to produce the most amount of carbon dioxide when you're actually pulverizing the rock. So if you can use ready rock, great, ready, at the right sort of size of particles, fantastic. But otherwise, we do need to think about quarrying, grinding, and transporting, and what are the impacts of that. We also need to think, of course, just like soil, not all rocks are the same. So what are these rocks made of? And how do they interact with different types of soil and crops and climates and so on? And then, of course, finally, as I said, if we are going to have more mining, are people happy about it? When the UK says that between 9 and 45% of its greenhouse gases could be removed through enhanced weathering, the 45% end requires more mining. So, of course, costs, we can't avoid them. At the moment, the low end and the higher end are extremely broad, and that's, I think, based on what I've already said, you can probably understand why. But latest data from the University of Sheffield, they say that by 2050, it'll cost £100 per tons of carbon dioxide removed. And one of the reasons there's such a wide sort of berth is because it does depend on the efficiency of how you're removing that carbon dioxide. Also remember that if you're using waste, mining waste or shallow basalt is going to be cheaper. If you're also able to offset those costs with higher yields, lower fertilizer, that's also good. So unlike, I guess, a lot of other greenhouse gas removal technologies, it's quite possible that deploying enhanced weathering initially could be cheaper, and then costs may actually then go up over time as more mining and grinding, etc., are required. So here's an example. This is an example from the North American Corn Belt, which is obviously not a small parcel of land. If we cover, say, 70 million hectares, and we apply 50 tons of basalt per hectare per year, there's an estimate today that that could lead in the long run to removal of 1.1 gigatons, i.e. billion tons of carbon dioxide. And that would be around 13% of the global annual emissions from agriculture. So not insignificant at all. And here is a map from the University of Nairobi research paper, which shows where some of those sources of rock are. It always amuses me when people talk about co-benefits. It's as if our primary function in life is to remove greenhouse gases, and it certainly feels like it at the moment. But I tend to think of it as core benefits. So for me, enhanced weathering is really agricultural solution, food security solution. And fortunately, it does remove greenhouse gases. And it's not just carbon dioxide. There's all sorts of potential on all things nitrogen. And the latest University of Sheffield work, some of the work that's going on there is not just about CO2, it is also about nitrogen. What is really important, and I'll keep saying it, is that we do need to think about the soil, how acidic is it, we need to think about the crops, the climate. Can enhanced weathering be used with other technologies like biochar? So from a co-regen perspective, we're looking at biochar and enhanced weathering to complement each other. And the Future Forest Company in Scotland are looking also at forestry, biochar, and enhanced weathering. Important to appreciate what we don't know today, and that could be sort of heavy metals and the risk of heavy metals pollution, depending on where you're getting the rocks from. If you apply rocks with a high rate, then there's a risk that the sediment runoff will impact your biodiversity in the water. And then if it's dry and windy when you're applying the rock dust, there's a risk of local air pollution. And of course, are we really sinking that carbon dioxide, and how long are we doing it for? And there will be some people that won't like enhanced weathering because it's going to reduce their fertilizer sales. It's going to reduce their pesticide sales. So we also need to be aware. It's not necessarily going to make everyone happy. That said, where do we as co-regen want to look at this technology? We do want to look at it in the tea sector. There's not been any work that we're aware of in the tea sector today. And we are going to have to be careful about the rocks we consider, whether basalt is indeed suitable. But our idea is that we find the rocks within 100 kilometers of the tea growing areas, and that we are able to measure the removal rate of the carbon dioxide, the pH impact, the nutrients in the soil, and of course, the energy and financial costs and trade-offs. The size of the rock particle is really key because obviously the smaller you crush it to, the more energy you may need to use if it's not already pulverized like that. And, what nutrients are available? What are the benefits? Are the benefits what we think they will be? So that's our plan. Uncertainties. This sounds like quite a big one. And it does it is important to point out that as of today, there are still no established protocols. So when people say, oh yeah, you can pay me $200, $2,000 for every ton of carbon dioxide equivalent that I remove from any technique, but including enhanced weathering, the first question is, well, how do you know it's going to stay there? So it is a little bit of a sort of a vicious circle, because until we can have some standardized ways of measuring this, investors are going to say, what am I really paying for? So it's work that needs to be done. Different people are trying to do it, including some of the startups. Here you can see some of the ways in which we could measure it. So the most obvious one is application tonnage. How much you apply on the soil is your sort of proxy for how much you're going to remove. But there are more, I guess, accurate ways of measuring this. But we're going to have to figure this out over time. We're going to have to test things like the electrical conductivity over a period of time to see whether what we think it's doing is what it's actually doing, by way of sort of removing carbon dioxide. There's always a risk also that some of that carbon dioxide could return to the atmosphere for any of these technologies, right? And from an enhanced weathering perspective, it's, then depends on sort of how that reacts in the water. And could there be degassing from sort of river estuaries or coastal waters? So the other big challenge is for any technology to scale up, you need a legal and policy environment that is conducive. And I've just used the United States as an example here, but any country is going to have to think about having legislation which actually does deal specifically with enhanced weathering, from the sourcing and crushing of the rocks all the way through to measuring of greenhouse gas removals, but also the impact on biodiversity and impact on soil and so on. The good news is we're not competing, as I said before, with land use, but there might be other sort of regulations from a land perspective you need to think about. You most certainly need to think about the environmental permits, the air, the water, the waste management aspect, and of course, as I say, what happens later on over time. Is there sort of other risks that we don't even know about yet? Finally, if you're either listening through the Global Regeneration Collab, or you're an investor, or both, and you're thinking, what's my sort of checklist when I'm presented with an opportunity here? What should I be thinking about? For me, what's really important, and I say this all the time, there are problems and there are solutions. And I think that sometimes you have solutions looking for problems. For me, if you have enhanced weathering being done for the right reasons, it's a solution to real problems. And so if you have a startup, for example, that is targeting only technology companies or only airlines, rather than one that is really looking at it more holistically and the agricultural perspective, I think that the agriculture aspect makes it far more appealing and relevant and valid. Then, as I said, Future Forest Company is an example of a startup looking at not just enhanced weathering in isolation. So does that startup, or is that research looking at enhanced weathering amongst other technologies? Where is the rock coming from? Is it mining waste? How shallow is it? How much of it's been mined? How far does it have to be transported? How long will it be available for? Is it the right quality? What sort of rock is it? What size particles? How much do you plan to apply? Where are you applying it? What's the soil type? The next point, I think, again, that I keep saying is, we focus a lot on potatoes, wheat, and rice, whereas they may not even be the right crops. Where I'm sitting, millet, sorghum, beans, please, would be, I think, a really important crops for us to be sort of thinking about. Of course, from my own perspective, I'm looking at tea, but that's just the first stage of our journey. What is the impact on greenhouse gas, both removing them, and what prospect is there for reducing your consumption of fertilizer? And then all the things I've already said around the health and the yields of your crops, the sediment and so on. Then you do need to look at the costs. Do you need to build new infrastructure? How much does it cost? And is your total cost going to be less than your fertilizer saving or not? Because these are all things that are going to impact really the take up of this technology. So finally, this is
On the
me.
25th.
Don't know me. I think everyone on this
Wow.
call does, but thank you ever so much for listening, and I'll be delighted to take questions.
Thank you, Aarti. So the floor is open. If you have a question, raise your hand or raise your virtual hand. Or a question or a comment, because some people here have experience in doing this as well. Brian, go ahead, please.
Thank you for that presentation. It's highly informative. It got me to thinking a little bit about rock dust weathering and how often have people looked at the degree to which there's potential toxicity associated with minor constituents in rock dust, anything from arsenic to, a variety of transition metals, et cetera. All soil, all rock dust will have some level of constituents like this. And has anyone evaluated these hazards?
So from what I understand, people are now looking at that. And that's why I said, the source of the rock and what's in it is really, really important. And interestingly, when I presented this to the investors, quite a few of them were American, and they got all worried about iron and steel slag and all these other things. And I said, I think you've got problems in the US already with levels of control of your water, and your water regulations are already so behind and so outdated. So I think back to enhanced weathering, it's going to be extremely important that any piece of research that gets done has to look at that. Yeah.
Good question. Godwin.
Thanks, are informative as usual, well communicated as usual. But one question I would like to ask is, in terms of, in the Niger Delta, I know you're aware of this, there's a lot of gas flaring going on, and there's a lot of damage to crops from acid rain and things like that. Do you see this sort of solution applying maybe on a pilot scale at first? And do you think some of the oil companies there could buy into it?
Fantastic question. We should go and talk to some universities in the area. The short answer is I don't know, but I think it would be, given the level of degradation and pollution, if this could work, wow, it could be quite incredible. But I think the first thing is to do the research. I don't know if anyone's done any yet, and I certainly don't know.
Aarti, as always, thank you very much. You alluded to the issue that we have tied to the power interests that are perhaps not so interested in us coming up with alternate solutions that cannot be controlled from their side. So my question to you would be whether you see any possibility in some sort of decentralized model that would allow for us to perform some sort of end around tied to these powers that be. One part of the equation, of course, being here in Europe, that's one of my personal opinion is one of the biggest problems we have coming from the petrochemical fertilizer industry that are basically running this vicious circle that we have. And so do you see any possibilities, perhaps making some inroads with the technology that you're working on right now to perhaps make some changes or at least bring some sort of impact along those lines? Thanks.
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges in sub-Saharan Africa is that the inputs that are used, the quality of the inputs can be very questionable, and then people are not using enough fertilizer. When I was in Limuru, just outside Nairobi, a couple of weeks ago, talking to tea farmers there, some of them don't even use enough K fertilizer today. Now, you could say, should they even be using some of these fertilizers? Let's pause that for a minute. The point is that when you're taking tea or any other crop out of the ground, you're removing nutrients. You need to put something back in, right? The how is clearly something that, I'm sure we can improve upon. But if I were to look at it from a Kenyan or sub-Saharan African perspective, I think it's a huge opportunity to turn around and say, this is a nature-based solution. This is a way we're not using enough fertilizer. Our soils are degraded anyway. So whatever these input providers want to do, well, we're not even falling for their trap. So let's try and use something which is better environmentally and better for people's health, etc., etc. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for policymakers in this part of the world to pull, the bull by its horns. Whether they do that or not is another matter. And I think that the likes of Noah, who's just put his hand up, and all the wonderful academics we've got on the call today, it's down to them to also be saying to policymakers, this is the way forward, right?
Thank you.
Energized now. I will. For those who didn't know, I took upon myself to transform part of an award that I was given into establishing an organization that would tell farmers the truth. And the truth is normally painful. I like part of your presentation saying that those who are selling fertilizer, they will not like such information. How can we then use, and I've worked with different farmers across Africa in different value chains. I've visited 4,900 different farmers. Some of the farmers that I saw really suffering growing tea. Tea is automatically like an easy cash crop, but the yield capacity that our tea farmers are getting is very low. So I started working with a few farmers on testing their soil and stuff like that. And they were really excited to see that even the soils had fusarium wilt. They kept on adding fertilizers, acidic fertilizer. The cost of fertilizers has gone up. Their yield is still low. The cost, whatever they're getting, is low. How can we be able to work together to make sure that this information hits the farmers? And then when it hits the farmers, farmers talk about it. Then we hit the policymakers. I mean, I don't mean hit, but I mean, we get to the policymakers because it's a conversation that we have very comfortably, that has been discussed comfortably amongst research academics, but hasn't trickled down to farmers. How can we be able to make sure that these findings of farmers are getting? I took a few screenshots. I will not share it without your permission, but just the fact that this can help farmers increase their yield, without thinking of giving more nutrition to the crops, but just fixing the base, the soil. How do we partner to make sure this is done?
So I mean, I think there's several ways. First, let's clone you. But if we can't clone you, then at least there are different ways in which, from what I've seen, farmers receive information, and it could be as basic as, first of all, start with the women, because all farmers are incredibly busy. So let's incentivize the farmers in whatever sort of training that needs to be given, create champions, so get farmers to train each other. If we can use SMS, if we can use video, I know Digital Green, they're part of GRC. They've produced thousands of videos in India, but also in Kenya and other places, where you literally have farmers or extension advisors speaking and about their experience with whatever technology, whatever technique that they're using. So I don't think it's a one size fits all, but for me, nothing is more powerful than farmers talking about their own experience. And certainly every time we've spoken to farmers in Kenya about biochar, they always understand it. It takes all of 2 seconds to explain biochar to them. And after that, the next question is, when can we have it? So I think all of the things I've just said, we've got all these organizations, and we've got no shortage of organizations. What is Fair Trade doing all day? What is Rainforest Alliance doing all day? What are you doing all day? And I think somewhere we've got to say, okay, who's doing things which are really effective? Where those projects are, where those farmers are, let's showcase them. And I know in a country like Kenya, there's no shortage of media, formal, traditional media and social. So let's just use all the channels we have. I don't want to make it sound as if it's all disorganized. It has to be sort of thought through. But my point is that there are so many channels that we can use. We've just got to figure out which are the best for the circumstances, whether it's all, we've got hundreds of thousands of tea farmers across Kenya, right? So how do we use the KTDAs and the KTGAs, and how do we get messages to trickle down? How do we get messages to trickle up, get farmers talking to farmers? Yeah. And we can continue this conversation offline, Noah. I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Aarti, for this presentation. It was very informative and lots of new information. One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of, the amount of subsidies for conventional agriculture, well, commodities, that it's so disproportionate, in terms of the amount of funds. We were talking about climate change, what's sort of happening at the very beginning of this call, disaster payments that go into sort of supporting the conventional system. I did see the UK, I did take a look, because I'm based here in the UK, at their sustainable farming, regenerative agricultural bill. And it does feel as though, as opposed to say what's happening in the Netherlands versus what's happening here, there is that opportunity to kind of do it on a more sort of scaled basis so they can study it. And this seems like, this is more of a comment of something to engage with policymakers on, because they're almost evaluating it as they go along with the sort of conventional, traditional subsidies that are going to farmers, to kind of helping them sort of transition. And this just seems like something, it's all very, very new information to me, but it just kind of seems like it's potentially something that would kind of go in line with the sustainable agricultural bill that I've just kind of sifted through a few weeks ago.
The UK government must be aware of enhanced weathering because it's funding a number of projects, and I know, because I've looked at the UK quite closely, that it's not the only greenhouse gas removal technology they're looking at. But as I said earlier, it's not just about greenhouse gases, it's also about food security. And so I think the UK is well on its way. The US seems now also to be looking at it. I'd like to hear from the Kenyans in the room as to what the government of Kenya is doing about it, because we all know food security is a challenge here. And we've got the Horn of Africa more generally. It's the situation is such that it's back in the headlines, right? So where is some of this being considered from an Kenyan, Ugandan, sort of Horn of Africa, whatever perspective, and then Sub-Saharan Africa more broadly? It does have to, one of the reasons I am a fan of enhanced weathering is because it does solve multiple problems. And I think the food security one is really critical. And as the recent research we've seen from the University of Nairobi shows, we've got enough shallow rock to start thinking about it, right? We now need to overlay that research with agricultural research.
I'm not an academic, but I think I just asked a question. What binds researchers? Because I find that we have a lot of good researchers in Kenya, some of them even at policy making, but that implementation, that knowledge doesn't trickle down. So I don't know what can be done. I think just to add on to the question that I was asking, is there something that binds researchers? I find that Kenya is more of a research country, because there's a lot of research going on. We have Jomo Kenyatta University, we have Egerton University, some of the top universities in agriculture. How do you then bring in that information so that these findings is merged, as you have said, Aarti, is merged together with agriculture? My media channel reaches close to 1.5 million viewers, farmers every month. Is there a way that information can be put in and then disseminated in a simpler way? Because it's high time that these smallholder farmers who are my age, 35 to 50 now, taking over our parents, they're already well knowledgeable, but they don't want to go back to agriculture school. So they want something that they can understand. This is good. I don't want this. How can I save on cost of fertilizer while repairing my soil?
I'm going to throw that question rather unfairly to Christine and to Cecilia, because I think that they're in the thick of it. And I say unfairly because clearly, I'm sort of, they're the two academics and actually we have Rosemary from Strathmore as well.
I could add what Noah was saying about information and how stakeholders, especially small-scale farmers, could be reached, and the role of the academic institution. Yes, research has been done in a more broader way in some of this emerging technology area and what Aarti has been talking about. But how do you translate this technological information in a manner in which local person can understand? So that's creating that hub, creating application, are creating ways in which agriculturists can be able to actually log in, maybe having water code to log in, and they get ready-made information that can give them issues that emerge in their product, in the kind of areas of market, as well as also some of the new findings that have come out in that area. So like what Aarti is talking about, quite a number of people are not aware of it, but how do you simplify? So training also the media on communication and communicating technological issues into an easy to understand, and then translating it into small, easy languages, like a small, simplified terminology that even anybody can remember. So like this bacterial infection, TR technology, how its readiness level, how can it be readily applicable to ordinary person? So that kind of technology application and communication is critical. Thank you.
And for those who don't know Rosemary, she's a brilliant institution in her own right. I know she joined late, so she didn't introduce herself, but maybe briefly, Rosemary, would you like to say who you are? And then Cecilia, I'd love to hear from you. Yeah.
Well, no, I'm just Rosemary Okelolale here, Director at Africa Media Hub, actually a postdoc at Strathmore University, but background is data, media, as well as ICT and technology. And I've got experience in GT in New York, where we worked in Ford, developed worked with the Global Partnership, and brought in NASA when we actually translated data, Digital Earth Africa, now it's Digital Earth Africa, but now it was data cubes that were adapted by various countries in the world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And Cecilia, we've got about a minute left, so go ahead.
So just a quick overview of the landscape. I think that the key issue is what you were talking about, yield, or what is talked about as the yield gap, not only in terms of the on-the-ground production, but also in terms of the population. So food security is one part, heavily dominated by yield gap discussions. The other is food sovereignty, which are the decisions on which crops to be promoted and invested in. Very relevant when you start getting into GMO discussions and looking at what type of technology goes to backing the type of yield that's needed for mass production, because there's never really been mass production agriculture in Africa is the other part. There's been subsistence agriculture production, but not mass production. So from that perspective, understanding the economic dynamics of mass production, I would say there's a cognitive dissonance on the behalf of the farmers. They will understand how to manage a 1 acre plot. They will understand how to grow tea or whatever crop it is to the point that they're able to cover their costs and able to then have a little bit of surplus income. But managing a farm in terms of an industrial scale, that is a cognitive dissonance. That I have not seen that knowledge other than sort of the large scale foreign managed farms. So I think being able to make these rational choices in between one way or the other, there first needs to be some capacity building in farmers, teaching them to understand and forecast at a mass production scale rather than a sort of small scale. Then what nobody in the world has figured out yet is how do you do polyculture at a mass production scale and make it economically viable for different, because you have, and on food sovereignty, you have different things like, you have machinery of food processing. There was a lot of, when we started cassava flour in terms of in Kenya, the machines for milling the cassava and turning that into different products had to be developed because everything was designed for maize flour, and cassava flour gunks things up and crashes machines. So even something as simple as switching from maize to cassava, which was good because we said, oh, those are tubers, and okay, yes, all that happened, but so this technology switching, I think, is a complex thing that we need to think about. Thanks.
Folks, we're at the end of our allotted time. So I'd like to thank Aarti. Thank you very much, Aarti, for presenting a second time and getting some great questions, comments. I hope it was useful to you, and I hope people learned from and were stimulated by that. I certainly was, even the second time. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aarti. Anyone who's interested in joining the meeting, we do this twice a week. Other meetings, we're much more conversational mode, so feel free to reach back if you'd like to join us. Okay, thank you.